Gemara tells us on the bottom of 39b, the Gemara tells us the following. That Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Chanina, Amar Rashi, Amar Rabbi, that we have a statement comes from Rabbi Zera in the name of Rabbi. Evet shenasa bas chorin. Let's say there's a slave who married a woman who was free. So a slave is not allowed to marry a free woman. So he married this free Jew. Bifnei Rabo, if he married this girl in front of his master, then we're going to say Yatsa. Here, Rowie, there's a seat right next to me. So if the slave marries a girl in front of his master, then we're going to say he goes free. Yatsa, he goes free. And what's the reason why the slave goes free? So the implication is Yatsa Cheres. Why? Rashi says on top of 48. We're on top of 48. Rashi says the Lav de Shacharei Lav Shavik Lamimsav Baschorin. If it had not been for the fact that he had already been freed, the master would not have allowed him to marry this girl. So therefore, that's an indication that she would have been freed. So this is the statement that Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rabbi. So Amarle Rabbi Yochanan said, I don't know, Kol Kach Yesh Biyadcha, that's the tradition you have in the name of Rabbi, that even if she just marries somebody in front of the master, if the slave just married somebody in front of the master, that's an indication that he had been freed and he goes free. But Anisho, now I go in the opposite direction. I have a tradition. I call it so that if somebody writes for his maid a document that he's marrying her, shtar erusin, he says, I'm marrying you, I'm becoming betrothed to you. And Meir says mikudeshes. Meir says, well, that's an indication that she's free and she becomes betrothed. The Chachamim Omer ain't mikudeshes. The Chachamim say he's not able to marry her because she's not freed. So we see from here it goes in the opposite degree. Not only if he sees her marrying somebody, would she not be free? But even if he himself tries to marry her, it's not an indication that he's free. So that's how Rabbi Yochanan challenges the tradition that Rabbi Zera had in the name of Rabbi. So comes along, the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Zera is saying it, Rabbi Zera is saying it consistent with the teaching of Rabbi Bar Shilo, that when is it the case that if you see the slave getting married in front of you, we're going to say he goes free. When it's like a case of Kisharabo Hiniacho Tefillin, just like in the case of where the master puts the tefillin on the slave, then the slave will go free. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments, in a few lines. So to here also, Kisharabo Hisio Isha. We're talking about a case where the master marries off the slave to a free girl. And so that's an indication that he had been free. Because if he hadn't been free, he wouldn't have married him off. You got a question, Judah? So the Gemara then says, is it really the case? So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. So the Gemara says, are you going to really say, is it really possible to say that he wouldn't have married off the slave unless he was free? So that's an indication that he wouldn't have made the slave do a prohibition of marrying a free woman. But the Chachamim say he's not Mekudeshes to this woman if he marries her. So the Chachamim saying he would do a prohibition? Is that logical? But the Chachamim are saying, yeah, just the fact that he's marrying her is not an indication that she's free, that he could be doing it in a prohibited manner, because you're not allowed to marry a slave girl. So therefore, the Gemara says we don't accept this logic. So therefore, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Chacham Mayaskinon, here, what are we talking about? Where he actually says to her, the case of the Chacham Rabbi Meir is where he says to her, Tzeibo Liskachibo, that he gives her the document and he says, go out with this and become betrothed with this. That according to Rabbi Meir, Yesh B'lashon Hazeh Lashon Shikra, that this is a language, the technical language of emancipation, and so therefore she's freed. Whereas the Rabbanan Savri ain't B'lashon Hazeh Lashon Shikra. The Rabbanan say it's not the technical language of emancipation. He's not freed, and so therefore he doesn't go free. And therefore, she's not betrothed because she's not freed under those circumstances. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So now we're going to analyze the statement we just said before, that we just said it's talking about a case where the master puts a tefillin on him. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Eved she'niach tefillin b'fnei Rabo. Let's say you have a case where a slave puts on the tefillin in front of the master. Yatzal cheres. We're going to say that the slave is free. Why? Because it's an indication that the slave must have been freed, or else the master wouldn't have let him put on the tefillin. So Gemara challenges is from a brisa. Meisvei lavoy menu rabo, or also rabo with trumpets, or sheniach film b'fnei rabo, or shakara shlosh psukim basic knesset b'fnei rabo. Harei ze lo yatzol cheres. But we have a source. This brisa says that if the master borrowed money from him, or the master made the slave an executor over his estate, or if the master put on tefillin, or if the slave put on tefillin in front of the master, or if the slave read 3 verses in the synagogue, i.e. got an aliyah, this is not an indication that he's free. It means just the master didn't object, but it's not an indication that he's free. So we see from here that this contradicts what Rabbi Shimon Levi said. Rabbi Shimon Levi said if the slave puts on tefillin, he goes free. And here he's saying that even if the slave puts on tefillin, he doesn't go free. So how do we deal with this contradiction against Rabbi Shimon Levi? So Amar Bar Rav Shilo Ksharabo Himiachot Tefillin. No, what's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi talking about? When the master himself put the tefillin on him, that's an indication that he's free, that he was already free. But if he just puts it on by himself, that's not an indication that he's free. You had a question, Hillel.
Why is someone being put on him at all? He's not Jewish.
He is no. So okay. So Hillel's asking, what do you mean he's not Jewish? Why is tefillin being put on him? So the slave is Jewish. He's a Canaanite slave. Canaanite slave is commanded in the time-bound positive commandments, and therefore the Tosfos says if he puts on the tefillin, he's able to even make a bracha on it because the time-bound positive commandments. The woman could do time-bound positive commandments and make a bracha according to the Ashkenazim. The Sfardim say she doesn't make a bracha. So this slave is commanding the mitzvahs like a time-bound, like a woman. He's commanded in time-bound positive. He's not commanded in time-bound positive commandments, but if he does them, he would do it and with a bracha. That's what Tosfos says. Yeah. So the point is, what we're saying that the women and slaves are exempt from time-bound positive commandments. They're not commanded in the mitzvah. But if they do the mitzvah, according to the Ashkenazim, they would say a blessing on them. So therefore, if a woman shakes the lulav and the esrog, she would say the bracha on shaking the lulav and the esrog if she's Ashkenazi.
And is this indicative of what we spoke about earlier this week, how then he would be set free if the master is giving him something?
So we're saying here that this is an indication of whether or not he was free. That if the master sees him doing this, it's an indication that he was free. Because why else would he do it? So if the master is putting the tefillin on the slave, that's an indication that he had already freed the slave. Or else, why would he be spending his time to do this mitzvah with the slave if the slave was not commanded in the mitzvah? That act is not an act of setting him free itself. Were you trying to say something, Bill? So but there is something powerful. Why is this the example that they choose? Why is the act of tefillin the example they choose? So the tefillin represents pe'er. The tefillin represents a crown. And like we see this by a Karban Pesach, that a slave can partake in the Karban Pesach, you have to first circumcise him. And because the concept is that a slave who wears tefillin is very clearly an indication that his master is not a human being, but his master is God. We put on the tefillin every day. It's an indication that we are walking in the army of Hashem. So the Gemara says, "Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan." So when Rav Dimi came in the name of Rabbi Yochanan from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, "Misha Amar b'shas misaso ploni shifchasi." He said the following. He says, if somebody said at the time when he was dying, listen, ploni shifchasi ayishtabdu balach hermosi. He says, while he's dying, my slave woman, don't enslave her after I die. Then Kofines Yarshem Bekosvin La Get Shecher. We force the heirs to write her a document of emancipation. We force them to write her a document of emancipation. Because mitzvah l'kayim divrei mitzvah, the mitzvah to fulfill the words of the deceased. So she's not freed yet, but we force them to fulfill what the intent of their father was and to free her. So Amr Lafan of Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. So when Rav Dimi said this, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi responded, Rabbi, don't you admit that her descendants are slaves, meaning she wasn't freed? He had a different teaching. He said, so look at the Rashi, he didn't free her. And it's not an expression of making her ownerless. Meaning don't work her hard. Don't work her too hard. But the offspring that comes out from her are for sure slaves. So why do you force them to free her? And why are you forcing the descendants to free her? Meaning to say it's not enough of a language. That language of don't work her too hard is not enough of a language. Maybe she was just saying don't work her too hard. Maybe that's all they were saying. They weren't saying to free her. So there was another statement, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Misha Amar B'Shas Misa. So somebody as he's dying says, Plonish Shifchasi Koras Ruach Hastaway. My maidservant, she did good by me. Ya'aseh la Koras Ruach. Do for her Koras Ruach. Be nice to her. Why? My time a mitzvah kayim divrei mace. Meaning to say she wasn't freed yet, but you have to do whatever she wants. And if she wants to be freed, you have to free her. It's a mitzvah to fulfill the words of the dead. Amar Meimar, Hamafkir Avdo, so somebody who makes their slave onerous, also Eved Elo Takana. The slave has no takana. Yes, Ari.
Why wouldn't he just free the slave before he died?
Okay, so that's a good question. First of all, we can't ask such questions about the Talmud because the Talmud doesn't say, well, why didn't he do this? The Talmud is talking about like the law. This situation happened, and now we're looking at it afterwards. So maybe this person, as he's dying, this is what he said. Well, he could have said something else. If he had his lawyer, if he had the Harvard Law School guy next to him who's telling him exactly what to do, yeah, he would have said it the right way, but he didn't have it. He was just in the farmhouse, and this is what he said. And now they bring the case to court, and now they're trying to figure out what his intent was. So that's the other answer. But the other answer is it's also complicated to actually free him, as we're seeing now, because that's the next cause that Amemar is saying, and it could be that Amemar is responding to your argument. Well, why didn't he just free him? Why didn't he just make the slave onerous? Because that wouldn't have been good enough. Hamafkir Eved, that somebody makes their slave onerous, also Eved Eno Takana. That slave is in trouble. Why? Because there's no way to fix the problem. What's the problem? My time a goofy will anyway. Because the issue here at this point is that since he declared him ownerless, so the owner no longer owns the slave's body, and so therefore he doesn't have a monetary interest in him. But Isuru the Ikugabe, but the slave still has the act of prohibition on him that he can't marry a free woman. So he was only partially freed. In order to be completely able to marry a free woman, you have to have both acts coming simultaneously. But now by declaring the slave onerous, he's forfeited that role. And this prohibition, one second, then let me finish the sentence. And this prohibition, he no longer can give to him because the slave has left his domain. Yes, Bill. And he has to declare him to be free via a document which would release him from the prohibition of marrying a Jewish woman. So therefore, he only did half of it, and now he can't do anything. He can't fix it. So Rav Ashi La'ameimer. So Rav Ashi says to Ameimer, is that really the case? So is that really the case? So he says, but didn't we say that in both of these cases that he goes free and he requires a document of emancipation, meaning to say that you can give him one. He says, Mar says, no, he meant tzarech, he needs one, but there's nothing he could do. He's in trouble. He can't marry a Jewish woman now. Alternative version of this discussion is Iko de Amri. The alternative version of this discussion is Amar Amemar, that Amemar taught Amafkir Abdo Vameis, that if somebody declares a slave ownerless and then the owner died, also Eved Eno Takana. That slave has no solution. My time. What's the reason why that slave has no solution? Gufalo Kanile, because the owner no longer owns the slave himself. Isurahu de Ikagabe, but but the slave still retains his prohibition to marry a Jewish woman. The Isura Lebre lo Moris, and he didn't bequeath this prohibition, the ownership over the prohibitions of the slave. He didn't bequeath that to his son, and so therefore his son no longer has the right to give him a document of emancipation. So says Rav Ashi Ameimer, Rav Ashi Ameimer, Vaki Asi Rav Dimi, Amar Rav Yochanan. He said that when Rav Dimi came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the Haki Asr Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan to Rav Dimi Tausa. He said So Amar Rav Asher Meimer V'Haki also Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. But didn't we see this teaching that when Rav Dimi came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that we force the heirs to write the document of emancipation. So they said, yeah, that statement that Rav Dimi brought, that was a mistake. The Rav Dimi Ta'usai, what was the mistake? Amar Mai Ta'isa, the Lo Amra B'Lashon Shechor. So he said that because there, he said, why was it a mistake? Because their father did not use it in an expression of emancipation. But if their father had used it in a Ha'amri B'Lashon Shechor, but if their father had said in a Lashon Shechor that you will be in document in a language of emancipation, we would say Hachinami. Indeed, Rav Ami and Rav Asi would agree that we would force the heirs to write the documents. And so therefore we see that a person can in fact bequeath this concept to his children. He says, no, I hold like Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, who says that Rabbi Yochanan did not say this at all. That Rabbi Yochanan was talking about a case where he said, I want you to do what's right for her. And so they didn't actually try to free her. He said, I want you to do what's right for her. And that means mitzvah l'kayim divrei meis. Okay, so now we have another case. Who discarta the Avdi? So there was this village, Rashi says discarta is a Kiryah. There was this village of slaves. This village of slaves was sold to idolaters. They took all the slaves of this village and they sold them to idolaters. Kalu Marvasa Basrai. So then all of this, the owners of the village who were idolaters, they all died. Also, Kamei de Ravina. So then the rabbis, the slaves came back in front of Ravina and he said to them, Amaru Zilo Ahadru. So they didn't know what to do because the owners died, who were the idolaters. And so the slaves came in front of Ravina because they wanted to marry Jewish girls. They didn't know how to do it. So they said, go back to the original owners, and let them write for you a document of emancipation. Meaning to say, go back to the first owners and ask them to write for you a document of emancipation. So the Rabbanan said to Ravina, but didn't we just say that Amemar said that if you declare your slave ownerless and then you die, that there's no solution there? Why? Because he didn't give over the Isura to his children. So the prohibition that she's not allowed to marry a Jewish man, that they're not allowed to marry Jewish people remains. And so this case is similar to that because they sold him. They sold the slaves to the idolaters, but the prohibition remains, and so the prohibition can't be inherited to the next generation. So Ravina said, he said, no, I hold like Rav Dimi, who said that you can write the document of emancipation after the fact. So the Gemara says, but didn't they say, but didn't we just say that Rav Dima was a mistake? He said, no, what was the mistake? His mistake was in that case if he didn't say it in the expression of freeing. But in this case, but if he had used an expression of emancipation, then it would be okay. Then you could give over this language. It's a by the way, very unclear Gemara. It's very unclear exactly what they're arguing about. But the Gemara seems to say the law is like Ravina, that the Ravina did allow in this case, for the original heirs to then write a document, the original owners to write the heirs of the original owner to write a document of emancipation, even though they had already given away their rights to the body of the person. You had a question, Bill? Okay, so now the Gemara says, so there was a slave that belonged to two people. How does a slave belong to two people? Two separate owners, and they a joint venture. They made an LLC. One of them got up and freed his half. He freed his part of the slave. Amar Idach, and by the way, this case is even more confusing. Amar Idach, the other one said, Hasha Shami Bi Rabbana. Now the rabbis are going to hear that the slave is half free, and we're going to learn either at the end of today's daf or tomorrow's daf, we're going to learn that in case where a slave was half free, the rabbis forced the other master to free the slave. They don't want a half slave, a half free. So now this guy was very worried that they're going to force me to free my half. So therefore, they're going to cause me to lose my money. Also, aknaya with no katan. He says, I'm going to give my slave to my young son because there's a law that a court can't force a minor to do something. So he gave over his slave to the minor. Sholcha Rav Yosef Brei Rava Kamei Rav Papa. So the rabbis didn't know what to do. So Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, sent to Rav Papa, what should we do? So Rav Papa said, Sholcha Kasher Asa Kenya Selo Gmul Yashiv Lo Birosho. Okay, he's playing tricks, just like he's trying to do. We're going to go back at him. We're going to bring it back on his head. Meaning, I'll tell you what to do. Anan Kimwa. We know that kids like coins. Mukminin law apotropos. Let's establish an apotropos, an executor, a person to watch over the child. So, meaning to say, Rashi says, for the child to select for him how much money it's appropriate for him to get for this slave in the market, because the slave would need a document of emancipation. We're going to jingle the coins, the cost of the shmei, and then the child will accept it and will write the document of emancipation for the slave. So, right. Well, Rashi explains this. We'll look at the Rashi. Rashi says Zuze in the top of 40b. Zuze davar muat liyanuka. The child is just getting a very small amount of money, and then the court the court won't be needed to force him. The child is old enough to have a sound mind to say, I want to free him. But you can't force him. So without the money, you couldn't force him. The apotropos himself wouldn't, the executor himself wouldn't be able to free the slave. And he wouldn't be able to force the orphan to do it. So therefore, it's a kind of a gray area that the apotropos can execute what the child's intent was. That's what we're saying. But the rabbis kind of tricked the situation. And it must be that the father is not alive anymore, or the father is not in the picture, because there's an executor there, and the father gave the slave to the child. So you might say that I once had this situation when I was the rabbi at Ohev. There was a very, very prominent lawyer, and he had a partner, a real estate partner, and they had fighting over a piece of land for maybe 30, 40 years. And they were driving each other crazy. So the lawyer called me. He said, can you come to my office? He said, this guy is driving me crazy. I know what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the property to the synagogue. And then I'll have him deal with the synagogue. Yeah, that's really what, and there's still, so I don't want to talk about which property it is, but the point is that was his plan. So the Gemara says, Dan Rabbanan Omer. Well, he gave the property to the synagogue, and the synagogue took a donation. It took the donation. The synagogue did get some money from it, but the property could still be worth a lot of money one day.
You got to take a tax.
He got a tax break. Yeah, he got a tax break and everything. He got everything from it. Yeah, and he didn't have to deal with this guy anymore, which was the best part about it. Dan Rabbanan Haomer Asisi Ploni Avdi Ben Chorin. So, yeah. So somebody says the language of I made my slave, such and such slave, Asiti Ploni Avdi Ben Chorin. If he uses this expression, I made my slave a free person, or Aswai Ben Chorin, or he was made free, Hareyu Ben Chorin, or Hareyu Ben Chorin, or Asenu Ben Chorin. These are all languages of expressions. Rabbi Omer Kana. Rabbi says that that's a statement to acquire his freedom. That's a sign of emancipation. The Chachamim Omer Lo Kana. The Chachamim say this is not a statement of emancipation. That's not a proper language. You have to use a proper language. Amar Rabbi Yochanan the Kulam Mishtar. In all these cases, you need to use a contract. He needs to give it to a person, and so it's only acceptable if he uses a contract. He says, I give such and such a field to such a person, or Nisuna Laponi, or Harei Shalo, Arei Shalo, and Nena Laponi. All these languages, where Meir says that you've acquired the field, and it says Rabbi Yochanan the same thing by a field and a slave. Tana Rabbanan, another case. So this is a different case. Omer Asisi Ploni Avdi Ben Chorin. He says, I made such and such a slave free. V'hu Omer Lo Asani and he says, no, I didn't make him free. Meaning to say, he says, I made my slave free. And the slave says, no, you didn't make me free. The slave denies what's perhaps in his best interest, but maybe he doesn't want to go free. So the slave goes free because we say he doesn't need to free the slave in front of him. He could have said it in front of somebody else, and that other person acquired the slave's freedom on his behalf. So the Gemara says, let's he says, Kasavti v'nasati lo, but let's he says, I wrote him a document of emancipation and I gave it to the slave. And he says, no, he didn't write it for me. And he didn't give it to me. Then we have a principle, that if the litigant himself admits it, it's the equivalent of 100 witnesses, and we believe the litigant. In that case, the person who's saying, I never got it. Let's he says, I gave such and such a field to this person. He says, there too, we have to be concerned, maybe he gave it through a third party. But let's he says, Kasavti v'nasati lo. He says, I wrote it, I gave it to him. He says, no, he didn't write it, he didn't give it to me. There too, it's like 100 witnesses. So the Gemara says, well, in that case, in the situation where he gave it and he says, I wrote it, I gave it to him, and the person says, no, I didn't, I never got it. Who gets the fruits of the real estate? Miochel Peros. Rav Chisda says, no saying ochel peros. Rav Chisda says the one who gives it eats the fruits. Rabbi says mishalshin es aperos. Rabbi says you give the fruits to a third party until you figure it out. You put them in escrow. So no, one is by the father and one is by the son. If the person who's getting them, Rashi says, gets it while the father is still alive, and he says he never gave it to me, he's believed. And so therefore, the one who gives it eats the fruits. But if he died and his son is the one who said, and the son is the one who said and he says to the son, your father never gave it, then we gave it to a third party, because maybe their witnesses will come and say that his father sold it and the son didn't know. Okay, so now up to the next Mishnah. This Eved also Rabo Apotiki. Let's say there is a slave who was his master made him an apotiki. What's an apotiki? Apotiki could be one of three things. It's a Greek word, but it means that let's say you have a loan. Let's say you want to borrow. Judah wants to borrow $1 million from you, right? Judah says $1 million. I say I'm designating. You've got a special Maserati that's worth $1 million. I'm saying I'm going to collect my money from that Maserati. That's called apotiki. That's called apotiki mefurish. You're specifying I'm going to collect it from specifically from that one. There's a more general term in apotiki that means to say that this property could be collected. You don't have to collect it, but you could collect it. And then there's an apotiki called an apotiki that's like a mashkon, where I could use your Maserati while I'm waiting for you to pay for me the loan back. And if not, I'll take that Maserati, but I'm even allowed to use it. But so the person says, this slave is going to pay back the loan that I owe you. So he says, I'm going to make this slave to pay back the debt. But then they freed him. Who freed him? The Gemara is going to discuss the different possibilities. Shura Sadin. What's the Shura Sadin? What is the expression Shura Sadin? Well, you know what? Yeah. Right, because Lifnei Mishura Sadin means beyond the letter of the law. So Shura Sadin means by the letter of the law, Eina Eved Chayav Klum. The slave doesn't owe anything. The slave is going free and he doesn't owe anybody anything. We forced the master, and we forced the master to free him because of Shtar Damav, and he has to write a contract for his value. Who? The Gemara is going to discuss who writes the contract. Rishon Gamliel says, Eino Kosev Ela Meshachrer. The one who writes it is the one who freed him. The Gemara is going to discuss these cases. So we'll just get a little bit into it. The slave whose master makes him an apotiki and he frees him. Mishachraro, who frees him? Amarav Rabo Rishon, the original master frees him. Shura Sadin, Eina Eved Chayav Kum Rabo. So he says, the original master frees him. So meaning to say, the Reuven borrowed the money from Shimon, and he says, my slave is Hirapotiki. And then Reuven comes along and frees him. He frees him. So Eina Eved Chayav Kum L'Rabo Sheni. So now the slave, let's call him Levi, becomes freed. He doesn't owe the other person. Shimon lent $1 million that he thought he was getting this slave. And now Shimon's out of luck because the collateral was freed. The slave doesn't owe anything to the Rabbo Sheni. Now, Reuven still owes the money, but good luck collecting it. He has no other assets, because if he had other assets, he wouldn't have designated the slave. So how is he able to do it? How is this able to uproot the lien? The Amarava, we had this recently. We had this Gemara at the end of Nidarim. You maybe remember it. Hektish chametz v'shichr mafkim midei shibud. Even if you have a lien on 3 things, it uproots the lien. What are the 3 things that uproot the lien? Hektish. If something was consecrated to the temple, even though there was a lien on it, let's say my field, you have a lien on my field, and I say I want to give my field to the temple. Temple wins out. Temple beats the lien. Also chametz. You have chametz in your possession. There's a lien on the chametz. You have to destroy the chametz because Pesach is coming. And shikhr, my freeing of the slave overrides the lien on it. You see from here, from this basic idea that the rabbis really don't want anybody to be a slave. They allow you to equate it with hektish and with chametz. Means say you want to beat the lien, you could just free the slave at any point. Element they tikkun ha'olam, but because of tikkun ha'olam, we want the world to run properly. Why? We force the master to write him a document. Why? Shema yimtzenu b'shuk. Let's say you'll find the slave in the marketplace. The Yomer lo avdiata, and they'll say, and the second master will say, "You're my slave." Rashi says, well, presumably the second master, because he has the lien on him. The first master freed him. So Kofin, it's Rabbo Sheni, he forced the second master, and also Ben Chorim, he forced the second master to write a document of freedom. By the way, why does Rashi say V'yotzi laz albanav? Why are we worried about him casting aspersions on the slave's children? What about on the slave himself? No, because presumably for the slave himself, he would have the ability to go to court and defend himself. But once he's not there anymore, who's going to defend him? So then you force the second master to make him free. And the slave then has to pay him back for the value. Whereas Rav Shimon Gamliel says, "Eina eved kosev," the slave doesn't give the money. Al meshachar kosev, the first owner gives the money. So what's the dispute? What are the arguments? They're arguing about a case where you destroy your friend's lien. You destroy the friend's lien, basically. So the bank has a lien on my house. Reuven comes along and breaks my house, right? I don't care. Fine, whatever. The house is nothing to me. I'm done. I'm moving to. I'm going to Burning Man. I'm done. I don't care about a house. It's capitalism. But the bank cares. But I didn't do anything. The Reuven didn't do anything to the bank. The bank had a lien. So that's the question. If you break the lien on your friend's property, can the bank sue you, basically? One says yes, and the other one says you're exempt. And that's indeed the statement. We're going to repeat this Gemara as part of tonight's stuff. Just want to say, as we stop the recording, I want to say that the schedule is that tomorrow